Hi, Rachel. How are you doing?
Hey Lars, I'm good. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. We have one Saturn square down and we have several to go. So I'm very excited to be recording this one because I think this is a very common one for me from clients, which is Moon square Saturn.
Yes, Moon square Saturn. And those who have it, I think really because the moon is our sensitive emotional parts. I think that Moon square Saturn people feel their squares,
They do.
perhaps more than other squares that we might be talking about in this series.
100%. Moon is your feels, and people are probably watching these videos because they have feels. So I think it's a great one to do early on. So should we jump right into it?
Let's jump in.
Awesome. Perfect.
Right. Here we go.
Perfect. So once again, we're taking the scare out of the square. And so, we're going to be using the same slide about squares for the entire series. So if you are binge watching these, you're going to see the same slide a bunch, but you'll just become a square expert like us.
Yes, and we'll say little things, we'll nuance at each time.
Yeah,
Give
we're
little
not robots.
about the squares, but yeah,
Totally.
you'll become an expert.
There you go. Yeah, no, totally. So like we talked about before, and we'll continue to talk about, squares are very personal. I think that's what makes them that's their tough component to being the tense aspect, is that it's very much sort of within. It's not projected out like an opposition.
Right. And so it represents sort of those patterns in your life that seem to repeat themselves, or that self-talk, that repeating voice of self-talk that might not be as uplifting as other self-talk. It's tension. It's what you're here to refine and what you're here to work on. There are things that you're perfecting, that you're moving into harmony.
Totally. And I mean, when it comes to a Saturn square, especially, I like that you use that terminology, because it's really about creating structures in your life that are stable and supportive.
Yeah.
I like this quote, which is, "It may not always feel comfortable, but tension is a useful condition." And I think that Saturn squares really do force evolution.
Absolutely. Because Saturn is represented with our physical manifestations. So what we bring from our psyches, from our inner lives out into the real tangible aspects of our day-to-day experiences. And so people who have Saturn squares, any of them, tend to be people who are not afraid of hard work, who are going to stick in, who are going to get things done. Saturn's like glue. And so people who have Saturn squares tend to not give up easily, and it makes for really successful people.
Totally.
Provided other aspects of the chart are also aligned with that.
Of course, yeah, it definitely needs to be supported. But like the last bullet point says, it is the Rocky montage. It points to whatever Saturn is squaring is definitely pointing to sort of like, what you will be working on, but is eventually going to come into its own and truly be one of, the most profound and the most important parts of who you are.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely.
Totally. Anything else on squares?
One thing I would say is that for any squares, often by progression, so with progressions, for those of you who aren't familiar with that terminology, with the progression, it shows how your chart advances and moves and evolves over time. And often we grow out of squares, our natal squares, by progression. They're still there. They're still a part of our personalities. But whenever that shifts for you by progression, often you've mastered that lesson, and it still might come up and it still might be part of your day-to-day or your life experience, but it's often not as challenging as when you're younger and you haven't grown out of that by progression yet. So squares represent real opportunities for evolution, growth, and the more you have awareness about the squares in your chart, the more the more you can be conscious about growing in those areas of your life.
100%. And so, for example, in my chart, I have 0 degrees Venus and Scorpio squaring 3 degrees Aquarius, Saturn and Aquarius. And so my progressed Venus is now 0 degrees Sag, meaning that it has changed aspect to that sextile. So is from what you are saying, does that mean that I've sort of graduated a bit?
Well, what do you think? How do you experience that? Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I have began to really internalize the lessons of that square. So very important for you at home, if you are analyzing your own natal chart, to incorporate progressions or an understanding of that, and seek a professional as well who can help you decipher that.
Yeah, definitely.
Totally.
Okay.
Cool.
So, should we talk about Saturn?
Talk about Daddy Saturn.
Yeah.
You can go for it.
All right. So I like to think of Saturn as being like a teacher, and I know we talked about this in the last episode. So if you've seen any of our other Saturn squares, this is just another way of bringing that information home. But I like to think of Saturn as being like the tough teacher in school that really wants you to do well and wants you to succeed and accomplish all of your soul's goals, what you came here to do. But it wants to push you. It wants to give you the pop quizzes. It wants to teach you the hard lessons and teach you the lessons the hard way. And so Saturn represents that aspect of ourselves that is gaining mastery and working to achieve something over time. It's not like Jupiter where things happen fast and it's like luck. It's like taking one step after another to accomplish your goals and to fulfill your soul's desires.
I love that so the word mastery, because using that verbiage, I in my sessions with clients who have important Saturn aspects, whether inappropriate or not, describe it as having the virtues of a leather daddy. And so very much that is the keywords that I attribute Saturn to could also be keywords for a leather daddy, which include discipline, structure, restriction, control, all things that you need to really embody in a high-minded way to master something.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think Saturn being such a tough love teacher, like a no-nonsense nurturer, like you're describing, is why it's been, lambasted in ancient times as a malefic. But it's really, the key to unlock your success or potential.
It is. And it also represents your own sense of authority. And one thing that happens during a Saturn return, which is when Saturn comes back to the same place it was at the time of your birth. And this happens every 29 years, like before your 30th birthday, before your 60th birthday. What happens during your Saturn return is you're often faced with a choice of giving your power away to your parents or to your mentors or your boss, or standing up and being the agent of your own life. And during a Saturn return, we're often, and if you have those Saturn squares or Saturn oppositions in your chart, you're often faced with those choices in relation to the planet that's aspecting Saturn in your birth chart. So for those of you with Moon square Saturn aspects in your natal chart, during your Saturn return, those Moon square Saturn themes come up for you. And again, it's like a passing a test. It's like a lesson. It's a gift, actually, because then on the other side of that, you're able to really heal some of the conditions that shaped your Moon square Saturn experience.
Totally. It's like Saturn is all about consequences, and positive consequences are rewards, and negative consequences are what we call consequences, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, which way is it going to be? Saturn is really all about reality.
Yep.
And
yeah.
like forcing you to face the music or the reality of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another way of looking at that is that Saturn rules the bones and the teeth, those hard structures of our physical body. And we have our ego has other kinds of structures, hardwired beliefs, deep set expectations that we gain early in our life experiences from our childhood. And so Saturn often represents those are limiting,
Mm-hmm.
and how and sort of the perceived and imposed limitations that we're here to overcome and to work through and to stretch ourselves beyond.
The perceived part, say it again for the people in the back, please.
Yeah.
Limitations.
Well, Saturn, to the ancients, that was the last visible planet that we could see.
Right.
And so it represented the boundary line of our solar system. And now we know that the solar system goes so much beyond that, and there's an entire universe and other galaxies and things like that. So it's not the limitation, but it's our idea of what limits us, that we often project onto other people or society or rules. These are all within Saturn's domain.
I think that's the perfect transition into this, into like discussing the moon.
Yep.
So that we can discuss the square. I love that.
Yes.
So like I said, the moon is really all about the feels. And when it comes to your feels specifically, it also involves other things tied to that, like your home. When you look at the sun in a birth chart, it's kind of forward looking. You really can sort of like, you look ahead with it. But when I look at the moon, or like when an astrologer looks at the moon in a natal chart, you're looking at where people came from.
Yeah.
So, tied to that, I'm big into not gendering. So just want to say that loud and proud. So, like, traditionally you relate it to the mother, but it's the maternal figure in my mind. And then I also included some like stimuli stuff. So like react and responding is very much tied to it. What else would you include?
Sure. Well, the moon is that nonverbal part of ourselves. It's the intuitive part of ourselves. And it's like the infant self. So when a little baby is trying to communicate their needs, they only have nonverbal language. And so they have to navigate, they have to go find ways for self-comfort when their needs aren't being met. And they also have to figure out how to get the attention of their early caregivers. And so the moon often represents that unconscious part of ourselves that draws in experiences that meet our needs for emotional safety, meet our needs for comfort. But those are the deepest needs that we have, that if they're not fulfilled, that we don't feel emotionally safe, or we feel vulnerable, or we can feel emotionally cut off. Mm-hmm. So
I love that you say that, because I think it's really important to recognize, like you just stated, and we talked about this before, is like you find how you self-care, or how you can best self-care in the moon, and this is a time I think that everyone needs to be self-caring.
Yeah, definitely. And if you're wanting to figure that out, look at what sign your moon is in and what are the needs of that sign. Look at what house it's in. And those are ways that you can meet the needs of your moon without drawing uncomfortable experiences into your life.
Totally. I would also add to that, and not to get super advanced, since I know a lot of people who are just learning astrology getting into this, but identifying the declination as well, to see if it's inbounds or an out of bounds moon, and working with a professional on that, because out of bounds moon people like myself, there's a larger spectrum that it might operate on, or a wider spectrum as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Anyone who's just learning astrology really should learn declinations, because they're as important as Ptolemaic aspects.
Totally.
Or they're significant in that.
100%. So if you have no idea what declination is, just put a pin in it. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, Google it.
Yeah, Google it. But I think that the best way to end with this is your own Rachelism on how the moon is an unconscious manifester.
Sure. And it really, because the moon represents our predominant needs, that make us feel safe in the world. Often what happens is we draw experience. If we're not meeting our moon's needs, we'll draw experiences into our lives that help us meet those needs. And so often, everyone's those who do manifestation, who are really conscious about it, know how the thoughts and the emotions attract into your life experiences like vibrations. Well, we have these subconscious likes, desires, needs, things like that. And that's the domain of the moon. And so often if you're, constantly manifesting like conflicts, or you're manifesting abandonment issues or things like that, ask your moon what it needs.
Yeah.
One example, Lars, that we were talking about just before this was, I had a series of Aries, of clients with Aries moons.
Yes.
And this was all like within this whole awareness about the unconscious manifestation came to me when I was working with this group of people. And there were like 6 or 7 of them at the time. And they were all dealing with conflicts in their lives. And some of them were big legal battles, and some of them were divorces, and some of them were friendship conflicts. But it was like a constant theme. And so I started to just ask myself, like, what is this about? And often an Aries moon, one of their predominant needs is independence, is leadership, is feeling like they're asserting themselves and using their voices. A lot of these clients were afraid to assert themselves and felt bad for being so vocal about, like they were the kind of people who might have like bit their tongue when they really should have said something.
Interesting.
And so they were getting the opportunity to meet their moon's needs, but not in a way that they wanted. Whereas if they had just spoken their mind and asserted themselves to begin with, it might not have played out in those ways.
But it just unconsciously manifested anyway because of that. That's super interesting. Also, would be interested to see where Saturn plays into these people's charts. I think for each one individually, I was looking at where their moon was, like how the aspects were. But that would be really interesting. Totally, that's a great example. And I now am going to be talking to my 9th house out of bound Sag moon. And asking what she needs.
Yeah. And sometimes, you can feel it. For example, when I have a Gemini moon, I shouldn't say that too loud, but
I love Gemini.
But I find that when I'm having a really bad day, I want a podcast. I want to read a book. I want to talk to somebody. I want people talking to me.
Mental stimulation.
Yep. Yeah. And so I think if for anyone listening to this, what is your go-to? What is the thing that you want to do after a hard day? And I would put money on the fact that there's a relationship between your moon and that comfort activity that you do.
Amen. I love that.
Yeah.
I'm going to totally use that as well. Thank you so much for teaching me your ways.
Yeah. So Lars, you need to travel.
I will say though, with this confinement, I'm quarantined alone.
Oh.
So, 9th house out of bound Sag moon, quarantine alone. I can't go on voyages nonetheless, like walk around the block, but I have like put on my full biohazard garb and like gone for walks as my biggest way to heal, for sure.
Oh, that's good. That's that would be something. I mean, because for a Sag moon, being outside is like a spiritual practice.
Totally, 100%. Should we do the moon square Saturn slide?
Let's do it. Okay.
Yeah, I love that. And you know what? I think in all of this talk about unconscious needs, it's important to really discuss childhood when it comes to either the sun or the moon square Saturn, because both of them have a similar kind of vibe where the native needed to mature earlier than typical.
Mm-hmm.
And I find with the moon square Saturn, if it wasn't like that explicit, it was that they got the hint or the note that they needed to become emotionally self-sufficient.
Absolutely. And I feel like that tendency is pronounced if you were born with Saturn retrograde, to where there might have actually been an experience of abandonment or a detachment from one of the parents, or some kind of addiction or something in the family, to where you had to take responsibility and grow up faster than you otherwise should have.
Totally. And I think as a result of that, there's like the deep need that a moon square Saturn native feels to feel safe or secure. Like security and safety are paramount. Don't take a moon square Saturn person to Vegas unless everything else in their chart points to a gambler.
That's right. Uh,
um, for
yeah.
sure.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think that is sort of a hallmark attribute of this aspect.
It is, and also a sensitive. Some of that need for security and safety comes from a sensitivity to where there's a fear of vulnerability that can come into play, where they feel vulnerable, they feel like they don't have as thick of a skin, and so they seek relationships that give them that sense of security, even if they have a difficult time like fully trusting that it's going to be there.
Totally. And this is a good time to remind everyone of how you described this is sort of like the limitations that are pre-imposed, or I probably used the wrong word, but like there are limitations that you think are there that aren't there.
Right, right. And once you realize that, and you realize that actually the universe does have your back, people really do love you and they really do care about you, and you are valuable and good just for who you are.
Amen.
Once you accept that as belief and you make that your mantra, then a lot of these things that we're talking about start balancing out, and then you get to make the most of this aspect, and and um and live some of the higher octaves of it, which
Totally.
which are
Uh,
giving back, which are creating a family structure, which are nurturing loved ones.
they're really good at that, I will say. So like I think yeah, once they come to terms with the fact that they aren't as emotionally fragile as they think they are, um they're really really great at nurturing others. And I'm sure that if I were to look at my close friends natal charts, there's definitely moon square Saturn people there, very
Mhm.
very great friends. I think in regards to unlocking the key, in achieving independence is a big key because of that childhood that I described. A lot of the times, even in adulthood, there tends to be not an indebtedness, but there's still that sort of tie to pleasing mom and dad, or pleasing, the authorities in the family, or the family ties.
Mhm.
So doing an inventory on if pleasing these people doesn't please yourself or doesn't nourish yourself, since the moon is your feels and is very much sort of like that emotional fulfillment. It's very important to do an inventory on sort of like what specifically isn't working there and addressing that.
Yeah, definitely. uh and the other thing too is, I think, navigating when you're giving because you're trying to prove your value or prove your worth to someone, or when you're giving just because of a spirit of generosity. um I think that's part of that, what you were talking about, Lars, with like disconnecting from feeling a sense of obligation to loved ones and creating more independence. But it's really being able to navigate within your own awareness what what's motivating your actions.
100%. And if you have that capacity to give love to others, you have it to give it to yourself too, right?
Yeah.
I think that's very important for Moon Square Saturn people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Marilyn Monroe is an example of someone who has
Oh,
Moon
that's
Square Saturn.
check.
Yeah. And so that you know uh, that that constant need to validate her worth, or validate, and giving and giving and giving to do that. um, that's something that's now, if you are a Moon Square Saturn, you have an innate sense of generosity. And
Totally.
like, you don't forget someone's birthday and you remember everything. so so you're the one, like, you're the family record keeper. And sometimes that the person who fulfills that role within a family system doesn't always get the appreciation that they need.
Right.
But you really, like, your heart is often in the right place. And so if you have this, it's a real strength that um, that 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 those in your life value more than you might realize that they value.
100%. And it's something to take pride in as well. And then I think it's important also to remind people, if they haven't had their Saturn return yet, or maybe they haven't had their second Saturn return yet, which I imagine is most people, that, you know, these limitations that you have imposed upon yourself, if you are hard on yourself for this aspect, you know, they're self-imposed, one, and by progression, you're likely to graduate and like learn lessons in order to unlock the high-minded values of the square.
Yeah, really good point. Yeah, so the Saturn return is definitely an opportunity to reevaluate and to face some of these challenges and overcome them.
Totally. Well, I hope this helped you at home who is watching this. And yeah, any closing remarks, Rachel?
I think just, one of the reasons why we're doing this series is because if you have some of these aspects and you're reading about them in books, you might get really scared of like, oh my gosh. And so hopefully as you're listening to this, you can realize that these are parts, these are aspects that relate to who you are and the nuances of your personality. And nothing is good and nothing is bad. So we're taking the judgment out of it.
Amen.
And really it's how your conscious awareness is how shapes how you respond to events that show up in your life, and also how you work with the aspects in your chart.
Totally. I couldn't have said it better myself. And if you want to find us, how can people find you, Rachel?
RachelLangAstrologer.com is my website. I'm also Rachel Lang Astrologer on Instagram and Facebook as well.
Perfect. And I am liveyourtruth_Lars on Instagram and Twitter. And then my website is coming very soon and will likely be the same thing. So very exciting. And thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.